Hello everyone, we're going to have a look at Unit 4 today, Laboratory Techniques and Their Applications. You would have already started this unit with your other teachers, so I think this might be one of the last assignments to do with this unit. And it's learning MDs, okay, so there's two passes, a merit and a distinction to get here. For P7, explain how scientific information in a workplace laboratory is recorded and processed to meet the needs of a customer and to ensure traceability. P8, explain how useful scientific information is obtained from large data sets and the potential issues and benefits. M6, analyze the differences in storage and communication of scientific information in different workplace labs. And D4, evaluate the challenges in organizations making available large volumes of scientific information. So, the lessons or the topics that we need to cover for this is data in labs, which is what we're looking at today, communication in the lab, which is what you did for me on Tuesday, and storing and retrieving information from large data sets. So let's get on with data in laboratories. For today's lesson, you need to be able to describe types of information stored in a workplace lab, explain how information is recorded and processed to meet customer needs and ensure traceability. So, the first thing we need to look at is what sort of information should be kept in labs. What sort of, whether it's computer-based or paper-based, what sort of information do we need to keep in labs? So you can have a go at this now if you stop the video. Okay, so the sorts of things you need to have in a proper working lab is you need to have some information on the booking in of chemical samples. So if something arrives, you need to make sure that that's recorded somewhere. If any chemicals leave storage, that needs to be signed out somewhere again. So you don't want to have a situation where chemicals are going missing and no one knows about it. Okay, we need to have an idea of who's taking anything out and when it was. The origin of the chemicals, so where they have actually arrived from, the location and use of chemicals. And when you work in a proper lab, like in a hospital, there are a lot of chemicals that are pretty dangerous. You want to make sure you know the origin of them so that you can reorder if need be, and you want to know where they are exactly just for ease of every day. Any reports of any analyses that have been made. So, for example, currently all of the labs in hospitals are working really hard on trying to make sure that the coronavirus tests are being done, and the results of those needs to be stored somewhere. Okay, so any results in here, I've just put weights of things. Unique sample ID number. Okay, so everything that goes through a lab, if we're taking the coronavirus example, every patient will have their own number. It will be anonymous, but every patient has their own number. A unique ID number. Now, it used to be that labs dealt with loads and loads and loads of paper information, which, as you can imagine, took up quite a lot of space. So what many labs have been doing is transferring information onto LIMS, which is Laboratory Information Management Systems. Those are programs and hard drives that store information electronically. So filing cabinets have been replaced by hard drives and the cloud. Have a think about the benefits of storing data using computers instead of paper. So what's not so good about paper and what's good about computers? Well, the first thing is that there is less space needed. There's less paper, so that means there's a lower fire risk. You can search through virtual information a lot more quickly. You can just type in a word and it will find whatever you need, whereas if you were looking for a particular piece of paper, it will take ages. You can access information stored using LIMS in a number of sites. So, if you had something stored on a website, lots of people can access that, whereas if you just have one paper copy within a filing cabinet, you would have to post it to someone. It can be updated quickly as well, whereas for a paper copy you'd have to rewrite the whole thing and print it again. So, this is the list of types of data that the unit needs you to be aware of in order to pass the assignment. So those are course records, scientific data, data on scientific apparatus, data on waste disposal, any health and safety checks done, training records for staff, any records of quality assurance, so how do you make sure everything's running correctly, report records, specification levels, sample throughput, and management and security. Okay, some of these are quite difficult to understand, for example the specification levels, but some of these would be a lot easier. So if you want to stop the video here and have a look at what is the reason for keeping the data and who should be able to record it, who should be able to access it, and who should be able to make changes. So if you stop the video here and have a go. Okay, so COSH records are records which basically show the workplace what sort of health and safety rules need to be followed. And the reason you need to keep that, so these are things like posters and methodologies and risk assessments, is to ensure the health and safety for staff and that the substances in the lab are being dealt with correctly. The people who should be able to access it are store technicians and anyone who actually orders and uses the substances within the lab. Scientific data, you want to make sure you have it to safely store the data generated by the lab and any other sources. Heads of department, deputies and lab workers should be able to record, access and make changes. Scientific apparatus data, you want to make sure you know when it was purchased, any maintenance data, any schedules for maintenance. As a college example, we have maintenance done on our microscopes every once in a while. So we know when they were purchased, when was the last time that someone came in to have a look at them, and when's the next time someone's coming in. And that's heads of department, deputies and lab workers again. Waste disposal. In the labs there is a lot of things that if you release them into an environment freely like you would rubbish on rubbish sites, it would really damage the environment. So we want to know how much waste is being produced and how can we dispose of it correctly. And that's store technicians and those involved in disposal. Heads of department should sign this. Health and safety checks. The reason to keep it is to show that health and safety is being monitored and any accident reports are kept. So if anything happens within a lab, you need to write that up. It could be that the same accident keeps happening to the same person over and over again, but you wouldn't realize this unless you were writing this down. And so maybe that particular person didn't go to one of their training sessions. So that's something that then could be tackled. Heads of department, health and safety officers and others with any special responsibilities should be able to access it. For training records, to know that staff has been trained in a correct way, and that should be the training officer, head of department, supervisors, human resources and the individual members of staff. So if you are working within the lab, you should be able to keep track of your training records too. Quality assurance is to show that quality procedures are being carried out for audit purposes. So if a lab is saying that they are doing some sort of test, so let's say they were doing tissue sampling to check for cancer cells, there needs to be some way of making sure that they are doing this correctly, whether that's someone coming in to do inspections or them receiving more training. But that sort of information should be kept by heads of departments, quality officers and anyone with special responsibilities. Report record, this applies more to GPs and hospitals. That's just the results from testing patients. And that should be office support workers and any clinical staff like doctors and nurses. And these next couple are quite difficult ones. So specification levels is the level at which the organization is allowed to work. For example, the danger level of microorganisms. We as a college can only deal with microorganisms that we know have been made safe, so they don't have any of their the dangerous DNA, shall we say. So they've had the infectious part almost taken out. Whereas hospitals and university labs will be given a higher level of clearance, so that they can be actually working with live viruses and live bacteria and organisms that could cause a lot of damage. Information about that is kept by heads of department and organization management. Sample throughput is the number of samples that you can actually get through a lab. So it's information about how efficient and effective the testing is. You would have heard of this on the news probably currently. They're trying to get up to like 100,000 tests for coronavirus a day, and currently they are nowhere near that. So the sample throughput is quite low compared to other countries. Heads of department and organization management should have access to that. Management information is just a hierarchy of who's at the top and what are the roles within an organization, who should change that and access it, well, it's the management themselves and human resources. And finally, security is any information on the levels of security within different labs. So that's heads of department, security staff, health and safety officers, and all staff really should know exactly what the security is, what are the fire plans, what to do if there's any sort of big accident like a fire alarm, And so the next part is to look at, out of all of these types of data, which ones should be stored on paper and which ones are better stored digitally. Okay, so cost records tend to be computer-based. Scientific data currently is still very much paper-based, unless someone transfers that onto a computer. Okay, so originally when you find out your experiment results, people tend to write it down first. Scientific apparatus tends to be paper-based in some places, but then others do it computer-based. Waste disposal is paper-based because it's quite important that you're able to move that piece of information wherever you need it to be. Health and safety checks, like the HACCP poster that you might remember from your assignment with Kirsty, that's paper-based. Obviously, it's a poster, but other bits of that can be stored on computer. Training records tend to be computer-based unless they are certificates. Quality assurance information is computer, spec levels computer, sample throughput is computer, management and security are computer. It makes sense to store as much as you can on computers because, as we saw before, there are many more advantages to that. Now, we're going to apply all this to a specific scenario. So there is a company that I have researched and will provide you some information with. This is Northumbrian Water Scientific Services. And there is a website right at the bottom for you if you want to access the information about them. But I will put on Moodle a big file that this company sends their clients to kind of show them what they're about. And so if you have a look at these types of data and have a look at the document on Moodle, you should be able to say whether you think that this company meets their requirement. Can you see any information about the scientific data, about training records, and then this column is for any extra information. Okay, so I'll give you an example now. So an example of that is, when you look at the cost records, in the booklet it says that the labs use a leading cost risk management system, and so they display posters and they label their hazardous chemicals, and that's paper-based for them. In terms of the scientific data they collect, they look at analyzing water samples for metals, nitrates, pH, pesticides, herbicides, bacteria, algae, taste and odor. And an interesting thing about this is that samples are transferred between the labs. They have 3 different labs and they use overnight refrigerated vehicles for that. Lab notebooks and computers are used. Scientific apparatus, they've actually listed a few of their big machines that they use. I'm not going to read them out, you can read them. They will have paper instructions, but electronic storage of servicing dates. There wasn't any information about waste disposal for that company in the booklet that I provided. In terms of health and safety checks, the clients are required to complete material safety data sheets to notify staff of any hazards associated with the samples. So when they send you the apparatus for you to be able to collect water, you need, and you know, for example, that you work in an area where there's lots of metal in the water, you need to let them know that. All sites have OSHA's accreditation, which is Occupational Health and Safety. That's paper-based. For training records, we know that they have over 100 of scientists. Those are scientists with academic qualifications, training, and professional affiliations. For example, things like Royal Society of Biology, and that's paper and electronic. Quality assurance, they have over 150 methods and over 1,000 tests accredited to different standards. And they also have independent auditing by 5 auditors who come in and do 300 audits per year. So they just come in and check that everything's running correctly. Reports are produced according to what they need. So they're looking at water. It could be that they're looking at the wastewater coming out from an area. And the language that they use for that should be clearly understood by clients and non-scientific companies. Specification levels, there wasn't any info on. In terms of samples, it says that they do 300,000 samples, and on those 300,000 samples, that's 1.2 million tests a year. So if they get sent a sample of water, they can do different tests on it, which is why you have different tests amounts compared to samples. Samples are barcoded to ensure traceability. So when a vial of water comes in, for example, it will get given a barcode so that whoever scans it knows where it's been and what needs to be done. Management are all managed as one unit, so the labs are managed as one unit using one LIMS, and that's all electronic. And for security, staff have ID identification and only scientists have access to the labs. So, having read that booklet, you should now be able to explain the process of analysis in the lab. So from booking in the sample to producing an analysis for the customer. So if you stop the video here. Okay, so we're testing the water for E. coli and pesticides. So the first thing that happens is the customer should send in a water sample, clearly labeling the location, time and date. The lab receives the sample and registers it on the LIMS. A barcode is added to each sample bottle. The sample will be tested for E. coli at the Horsley or the Hanningfield lab. There's also a third lab, but that lab does not test for E. coli. The lab book results are transferred onto a computer, and then the sample is transferred between, or overnight, that should say, in a refrigerated vehicle, where it can go to the Howden lab. Okay, so this is the third lab. The barcode is checked, and the sample is tested for pesticides. The lab book results are again transferred onto a computer, and then the scientists will write up a report of the results. So did they find any E. coli? Did they find any pesticides? But they have to write it in a way that's appropriate for the customer, because the customer is likely not a scientist. And then that information will be communicated in a meeting or in a report. So, why is there a need for traceability? Why do we need to know exactly where a sample has been and where it's going? The company makes sure that there is traceability by barcoding samples. They sign documents so that they know who's done any tests. There are logins and passwords to computer documents as well, so that you can see who's edited it last. And why is that important? Easy identification of mistakes is a big thing. Is if someone's messed up a test, they need to know who it was and when, so that they can maybe discard the whole batch. And it helps to isolate any of those contaminated samples, but it also helps to know the transparency of the process, so exactly what's happening. Customers may want to know that. And it ensures that there's minimal disruption to the process if something does go wrong, while maintaining the quality of the product. Now, in terms of meeting customer needs, to try to make sure that the company does it, they can make sure that they present information in graphs and tables. Visual information tends to be easier for customers to look at and understand. Any scientific key terms that the company uses need to be explained. So if they use a big word that a normal person on the street would not understand, they need to explain that in the report. They should use quite simple language if they can, and they should be able to give the customer some way of contacting the company in case a customer has any specific question. Okay? If you could send me evidence of the work that you have done for this lesson in a Word document or in pictures, paste it into a Word document and submit it on Moodle, please. Make sure that you've put ticks and crosses anywhere where you've got things right or anywhere you've got things wrong. This PowerPoint will be very, very useful to you when the assignment comes out. Any questions, just let me know. Thank you.